I'm just waiting for the slide to come up. Anyway, thank you very much for those introductions. Those of you who know me already will come no surprise that we have a few other people to introduce today on this slide. We have a series of dogs at the bottom. Tess is my dog on the far right. We have Shadow in the middle, and then Stone on the left. And then separated slightly, because even though the dogs like them, the cats don't, we have Alison's Oliver and Stormy. And I'm actually very proud that Tess appears in all my workshops and things, but this is now becoming a trend. And the Kerr workshop yesterday, everybody was showing their dogs and pictures, so it's a coming out process. You might have thought ISSOTL was a coming out process, talking about teaching and learning. The new one is saying you have dogs and cats. Yeah. Okay, students are change agents. I want to get a bit of a feeling of people in the room first, just a show of hands. How many faculty here have co-researched with students about ISSOTL projects? Wow. Excellent. All right, how many people would self-identify themselves as students? We've got a good smattering of students here as well. And how many of those students have also co-researched, or on their own even, done ISSOTL projects? So how many students here have actually been involved in ISSOTL projects? Slightly fewer. Okay, we have some expertise in the room, which is great, because I want to touch into that. You will have already seen there's a handout on the tables. This is going to be an interactive session. I see one or two people are sitting on their own. You may like to move, because you will need to talk to somebody else. You have to be sociable in this one. You can't sit on your own. And there are plenty of tables at the front. As always, they fill up at the back first. So make sure you have a handout, and you will be sitting next to somebody else. That's important. Okay, students as change agents. One more thing before we do. We want to just dedicate this particular session to Sue and her dog, another golden retriever, Maverick. And Sue, a wonderful person who wants us to have fun today. So that's what we're going to do. Learning should be about fun, and we should have some fun this morning. Now, this movement actually started in the schools. But there's been a growing interest in higher education. And just an indication, we have a special interest group here of students as co-inquirers. And they are meeting, in fact, immediately after this session. They have a session later this morning. Some of you here were involved in the collaborative writing group for Monday and Tuesday, and one of those groups was actually looking at students as change agents as a topic. Can you hear me all right? I'm getting a bit of echo here, but that's okay, reception? Right, I've got both mics on, so that's okay, is it? Yeah, thank you. The Kerr workshop yesterday also had students as change agents. So it seems to have been the time for this topic. It's really taking off. For the session, I'm already gathered, setting the scene. And then after about 20-25 minutes or so, we'll go into the panel session with the questions and answers. And as part of that panel session, each of the panel members is going to make a very brief comment on certain aspects of it. But I'll explain that part when we get to it. Somebody sent me, I think it was Betty, sent me this cartoon recently. And it's not only true, it actually looks like me. So I have to admit. But since I've been here, I have met one or two other people who have also Skyped their dogs. I'm not the only one. I want to start with a rather long quote. I hope you can read that where you are, because I don't want to read it out. So I'll just give you a moment to read that. This comes from Exeter University, who've been leading the way in the UK on this topic. This is Liz Dunn's quote. I think it's a wonderful quote, and it really summarises what we're trying to do today. Students as change agents, a term which is bandied around and used in a variety of ways. We're going to use it in one particular way, and that's not necessarily to say that's any better than any other way, but it's what we're going to talk about this morning. And that's getting students involved in the teaching and learning process and activities in their institution. They're change agents about teaching and learning in their institution. It's also used, of course, as students go and try and make changes to local communities and do community development and service learning on. We're not talking about that this morning, nor are we talking about what one or two people did yesterday in the Kerr workshop, talking about the skills students gained simply by doing a piece of undergraduate research, and that skilled them up to give them more confidence to become change agents later. It's part of the process here. Our particular focus then is on students, as I say, going beyond the voice, going beyond simply asking them their opinion, which we all do a lot of, to actually get them at the table as co-designers, as co-researchers into the teaching and learning, making some difference to the teaching and learning in their institution. That's our definition for this morning. Now, it's not a term I've used very much until recently, but I realised thinking back that I have been involved in one or two projects which would actually come under this heading. So about 3 years ago, we were designing, or slightly longer than that, a teaching and learning strategy in our institution, and we involved students right from the beginning of that process, not just to ask them their opinion, but actually involve them in designing and actually launching that project. And it's one of the case studies in the handout. And I've also been involved in a Change Academy process. A lot of people here from the Higher Education Academy. I think they'll be talking later about Change Academy. It's a wonderful process. We're getting institutions to develop a year-long process about a project and a 3 or 4 day away event, and that event includes at least one student per project. And we did it as a pilot in a subject area, geography, earth, environmental sciences. And that's been written up and is coming out in the next edition of IJAD. Okay, this is the theoretical framework that Liz Dunn and Zoe Zandastra have published. I think it's a very useful summary of the basis. And you see the axes there, from emphasis on student voice to emphasis on student engagement, and the extent to which the university is a driver or the student is a driver. And they have the 4 boxes. The top half, students as evaluators of their experience, and students as participants in the decision-making process. And that's more the student voice aspect of the equation. And then in the bottom half, students as partners, co-creators and experts, and students as agents for change. And it's the bottom half of that diagram we're really concerned with this morning. Slightly confusing, I think, the diagram, because you have students as change agents both as a single box in the bottom right-hand corner and the description of the whole diagram. But it's largely the bottom half that we're going to focus on. So it's those two in yellow is our focus for today. Now, in collecting a set of case studies over the last 12 months, people, and many people in this room have contributed to that set. It struck me they seem to fall into about 4 groups, though many of them could actually fall into more than one group. So that's the classification we've used on the handout, where students are acting as pedagogical consultants and ambassadors, as co-designers of courses, as SOTL practitioners, and just a few where they get involved, and I've given one example already, as strategy developers and advisors. And I say in all those cases, the ones that I'm looking, the students to greater or lesser degrees are going beyond the student voice, and they become co-creators and experts, with the potential for transforming teaching and learning. So this is the exercise I want you to do. There are a large number of case studies. You have it as a resource to take away. But in the next few moments, I'd like you to at least choose one of those examples, just dip into something that looks interesting, quickly skim read it, whatever the heading is, and just talk to the person next to you. And you might check the person next to you is reading a different one to you. See if there are any interesting ideas that gel with you. And many of you are engaged in these processes. And I'll invite a few people to comment on something interesting they found or tell us something they are doing in their institution which is not included. Now, this is the sort of time when plagiarism is encouraged. You're trying to see if there are any ideas there you can pinch and apply in your context. So if you're reading something you find it boring, life's too short. Find something more interesting. So a quick skim read of at least one and talk to your neighbour, and in 5 minutes' time I'll invite a few people to comment on interesting things they've read about. Exercise clear? Okay, if we could come back together. Some of you will have heard the Tibetan prayer chimes to bring your attention. They're meant to encourage reflective thinking and positive thinking. What more could we ask for? So I don't want any negative vibes now. These are all positive thinking. So we're going to use appreciative inquiry. So rather than the ideas that you didn't like, please tell us about the ideas that you did like. We want some positive thinking here now. So your chance to make a few comments, either on ones you've read, why you found those particularly interesting, or perhaps things that you do at your own institution that you would like to share. We do, as yesterday, have a couple of people with microphones. If you just indicate that you'd like to speak, they'll come and give you the opportunity if we have the time. And could you just introduce yourself and where you're from whenever anyone's talking? So who would like to make a comment on something they've read or an idea they already do? We got... Run! Thanks, Nicola.
Well, somebody's got to start it off.
Yeah.
I really liked on page 14 the one around 2.17, engaging students, empowering them to co-create the curriculum. It sounds like there's quite a success story there of going from a program where there was low attendance, there was low satisfaction, and it looks from this little bit like they've really turned things around. I'm quite interested actually in getting in touch and finding out a little bit more about the kinds of assessments they did and what they see as the future of the next piece of that program.
Yeah, I think that it is a good example in the sense of a problem and how they actually move to a solution. Colin Bryson, I think, has about 3 different examples within the handout. He's the chair of what we call in the UK the RAISE group. It's actually on the back page, Researching, Advancing and Inspiring Student Engagement. So he's been leading quite a few of the ideas about student engagement in the UK, and it happens to be one of the things that he did at Newcastle. Another comment or share something you do in your own institution. The student helpers will be very fit at the end of this conference.
Hi.
Hi, Leslie.
Leslie Jane Eales-Reynolds, Kingston University. An observation and then a comment. 2.4, which is about students and staff working together in inquiry activities at Birmingham City. I should point out it's in partnership with Kingston University. Sorry, I just had to get that in there. But there was an observation made at our table that there were an awful lot of examples here from the UK and Australia and not so many from the US. Okay. And we were wondering whether or not that's potentially because of the QAA and the authorities that require us to engage students in all that we do. Not that we don't want to, but whether that's sort of catapulted us forward faster than most.
Yeah. I think that's part of the discussion we're going to have, particularly with the panel later, but just an observation. In a sense, this was just using my networks and listservs. I collected quite a few examples here at the conference last year, and that there's certainly a bias towards North America, UK and Australasia. But yes, one of the purposes of this is ongoing work, and I really encourage those of you who are engaged in this, and a lot of you stuck your hands up at the beginning, say you've got experience of co-researching with students, for example, to share those ideas. And I want we run another workshop to have twice as many examples of that, and I hope many people here will contribute to that and change that balance, because the bias, at least in the audience here, for North America. But there are quite a lot from North America here, and people in the audience from that. And you might find, if you search there, Leslie, there's another example from Kingston before you got there. Leslie's just joined as Pro VC at Kingston, which is why that plug came in. One more example somebody'd like to comment on. I think somebody's showing a hand because the students are moving. The students can see the hands better than I can.
I am from the United States, so it's our first sort of engagement in involving students in research and changing curriculum. And at my institution, I'm a psychologist, and we teach a 3-semester research sequence, teaching students how to be researchers. And so this last year, my colleague and I decided that we would let the students shape the curriculum for that sequence. And they became the designers of the research questions they were interested in. And as a group of 40 students, they co-designed 4 different research projects that they started from start to finish and collected the information, presented it, one of the studies was on online cheating behaviors of students, and so they're actually publishing those research projects. But in terms of using them in curriculum change, they actually changed the structure of that entire sequence so that it's student-led and not instructor-developed. And the commitment to the projects, to the research, to the ownership was incredibly astounding from their point of view. It was no longer my course, and they really felt like they had designed and become experts in a field. So it is engaging them in a different way.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And I hope you'll write me a paragraph for it and send it to me. We can add it to the case studies. So, yeah. Okay, we'll move it on, and plenty of opportunity with the panel discussion to contribute a little later. Here, just a couple on this is the Students as Change Agents publication from Exeter University, and the latest issue of the Kerr Quarterly happens just by coincidence to have a theme of Students as Change Agents, and quite a few of the examples in there are taken from that. I managed to get an advanced copy. One of the things I've done on a number of projects recently is when you're working with other people, you have that in that discussion of what on earth are we studying? Can we come up with a common definition of what it is? I found actually that's sometimes not a very helpful discussion because we can never agree what we mean by terms. So what I've used on a number of projects now is to map the dimensions of the topic rather than try and come up with a single definition. In other words, to value the variety and the differences rather than to try and just look at the commonalities. And so I try and just mapping some dimensions of students as change agents. So is the emphasis on student voices? Is it an emphasis on student partners and leaders? Is it controlled by faculty? Is it student controlled? Is it institutionally driven? Is it student driven? And you can keep going down that list in that way. And I'm sure you could add a few other dimensions which might describe projects that you're involved in. But you could use that then as a way of perhaps mapping some of those case studies you've been looking at and say, where do they fit on those different dimensions? And if you do several different schemes at an institution and you find they all map in the same area, that might suggest, well, we've got some opportunities for looking at some different ones which might map on different aspects of those dimensions. So it might just stimulate some discussion for filling some gaps. Let's go on too fast. Okay. This is really just part, I think, the change agents, I conceptualise it as part of a much wider agenda of, so in the UK we talk about as students as producers, as against students as consumers, and that debate's certainly going right across the Western world. And I think students as change agents is just part of that debate, it's just a distinct part of it. And Mike Neary at Lincoln University, who's worked in this area for a long time, I think makes a useful distinction about students as producers working on several different levels. It can be a curriculum development project, it can be a model for whole institutional change, and it can also be a social movement concerned with reinventing the idea of the university. And I think there's some challenging ideas there which affect us with the students as change agents dimension. It can be things we do in the curriculum. It can be a way of trying to change the nature of the whole institution. But it can even be more radical than that and actually challenges some of the ways that the university operates and the nature of higher education. So I'd like to end on, I think the keynote speaker yesterday was saying that we should have just one strapline, Tawny's advice, one sentence, one sentence. This is, I think, where we would like to see our vision of where we'd like it to be moving. That we think it should be the norm, not the exception, that students are engaged as co-partners and co-designers in all university and department teaching and learning initiatives, strategies and practices. We're a long way from that, but that might be a direction of move that we're going in. So, without more to do... I have two ones. We have to come back to the dogs. And if anyone... she looks very angelic there, but if you look at the video on my website, you'll find that's less so. And even this morning, I had an email from Lynn Hunt. Some of you know Lynn Hunt, currently at University of Western Australia. And she sent some examples of dogs which had done bad things. I just put a couple of those on to end up. So dogs are not always wonderful. But... OK, I think that's far enough of the dogs. Can I invite the members of the panel to join me, and we'll move into the next session. Okay, is this mic working? You hear me? Yes, thank you. I think they'll go up and down a little bit as we each talk. Thank you. Most of you will have seen the invitation to send us in some questions in advance, and really thank you for those of you who did so. We've got too many questions, I think, to take them all, but we have put together a set of ones, and I do want this to be an interactive one. I know the room's not conducive to that, but I hope you will be brave and put your hand up and join in the discussion, ask questions, but also make comments. And answer the questions. This is not something where we are the experts and have the answers. We're all experts here, and I want this to be as interactive and contributed as possible. That depends on you being willing to participate. And there are a mixture of questions. Some of the questions are about student experiences, some are about faculty experiences, some are about institutional policies and practices, some are more conceptual, some are more practical. They're all valid questions. But in the spirit of not asking the panel to be the experts, the first question I want to address to you. So I'd like one or two people in the audience perhaps to give their views on it, because many here are very experienced in this area. So the first question is, how do you respond to faculty who say that students do not have sufficient knowledge or experience to engage in ISSOTL projects or to contribute to the curriculum? I already have a hand up there ready to answer, which is great. So there's one at the back left. Can you keep your hand up, please, so that they can... Oh, yeah.
Hello. Hello, I'm Jim Greer from the University of Saskatchewan.
Can't hear you at the moment. Is it on?
The microphone is on.
The microphone is on. The microphone is on, yes. I'm Jim Greer from the University of Saskatchewan. When faculty are concerned about the credibility of the student voice, one of their worries, I think, is sort of the consumer mentality that many students come with. And I think my response is it's better to have students be producers than consumers. And by encouraging them to actually being involved in productive ways to change the educational system, it actually does help to stem that tide of consumerism that every faculty member is quite worried about.
Thank you. I'm sure there's some more comments on that particular aspect, or another comment anyone would like to make. So keep it with the audience for the moment. Anyone else like to join the discussion? There's one here at the front.
I'm Alison Thomas from Douglas College. I just wanted to say that several years ago at Douglas College we had a project in which we proposed to invite students, not just as research participants, but as co-inquirers in the final phase. Up till that point, we'd done interviews with students, we'd done surveys with them, and in the final phase, we wanted to find out in a different way what students thought specifically about working in groups with others. And we had a shrewd suspicion from what had happened in the first phase when we interviewed students that they self-censor. There are some things they won't tell faculty. And we decided it would be really valuable to have focus groups in the third phase run by students, with students, in which we were not present. So we recruited students who were interested in participating in this, and they mostly did it because they were interested, not for the meager amount we were able to pay them. And it was really powerful learning for us. Obviously, we had to provide them with some training because not all had done that before, but they were extraordinarily capable. Two things I'd like to say about this. One is that the findings were really testament to the value of doing that, because we found things in the transcript students would never have said with us present, which was really valuable. The other, which is a bit more telling, and I'm afraid it's not so positive, is that when we came and did a presentation at a previous ISSOTL conference and talked about planning this, a number of people at the conference expressed, skepticism about whether or not the students would be capable of it, whether we shouldn't sit in with them, whether we shouldn't monitor it in some way. And so I think we continue to be a little bit skeptical, maybe beyond the point at which we should have given up those ideas. And yet, if you actually do this, you will see what students are capable of. And we did.
Lovely. Thank you very much for that. Alison, I'm sure you've been involved in trying to persuade faculty at your institution. How do you go about it?
Well, one of the things that I talk about a lot with faculty and with students who are involved in this work is different kinds of expertise and different kinds of knowledge, that it really isn't necessarily about replacing one arena of expertise or one set of skills and insights with another. It's about bringing those together. So it seems to me that a constructive way to think about this is not as having students come in with greater knowledge than faculty or with greater expertise in some way, but with completely different knowledge and expertise, as people who've sat in classrooms for a very long time, who have insights about what it feels like to be in classrooms that we as faculty forget really quickly, when we're not in that role anymore, and that it's really about bringing those perspectives together. And it's always the case, I think, when you have multiple perspectives that you have a better sense.
Excellent. We're going to move on to the next question. I'm sure you can come in at a later point on others. This actually was based on a question that Simon Nujumbois, and I apologize I got that pronunciation wrong, at Roberts Wesleyan College sent us. And the question is, Woodrow Wilson, when he was president of Princeton, suggested that changing the curriculum was harder than moving the location of a cemetery. In what ways can students realistically help bring about curriculum change in higher education? Natalie, can you start us off on that one?
Certainly. So I am a master's student in a faculty of education here in Canada, and what I observe in the pre-service teachers surrounding me, so pre-service meaning they haven't started teaching formally in a classroom yet, is that there is a culture of fear built around their options about what they are allowed to teach. And this culture of fear seems to be perpetuated to the point that they believe they will be fired for the slightest shift away from the wording of the curriculum, right? Teaching something in a different way so that it actually meets the needs of the students. And sometimes what I've observed and experienced, I think, in my post-secondary experiences is that a little bit of that fear comes into those settings too, and that often professors as well as students forget what we are capable of and the freedoms we do have to make change. So I think step one is overcoming that concept of fear and having a genuine conversation with each other about what we can do. Second point I think I would make is that you do have allies and students for curriculum change, that there's a body there that's organized and wants to respond to this idea, but it may be the first time they've ever experienced this kind of invitation. In my K-12 experience, it certainly wasn't promoted. And so there may be initial resistance to being included in curricular change because it's something new. the invitation of how students become engaged in that curricular change is really important. And I think being scaffolded into those opportunities sets up the partnership for success.
Any comments, questions? Please come in where the microphone is. Thank you. And then there's one in front of you.
Thanks. Marcel Dion from the University of Saskatchewan. First of all, with all due respect to Woodrow Wilson, I think making change at a university is like redirecting a glacier. I'd just like to relate an experience that I had with students in curricular change. I brought information to our curriculum committee about how our students were performing on national exams and various other data related to our curriculum. The curriculum committee and many of the faculty found fault with the test, or they dismissed it, or otherwise tried to ignore the information. And I continued to just bring the information forward. And what I found was that it was the students that picked up the information and kept bringing it back and saying, we would like to make this change, or we're interested in doing this differently, because they picked up on the information and they started to run with it. So it was a matter of providing the information to everyone, and the students on their own initiative, because they had some enlightened self-interest, became then change agents using that data to push the glacier in different directions.
Thank you very much. Gentleman in front of you.
I just wonder whether we're using some words that should not be used. Perhaps we should expunge the word curriculum. After all, a curriculum is a racetrack with a clearly defined starting point and an end. And if we really want real learning, there should be really no end and no starting point. And also, we use a lot of buzzwords that actually don't seem to make sense. We talk about lifelong learning. So when do we really evaluate it? The moment you're going to the grave or the crematorium? Oh, don't go so soon, dearest, we haven't evaluated you. I mean, half our problem is us. We use words that don't make much sense. We talk about a teaching load. When have we ever talked about a research load? Why don't we call it teaching privileges rather than teaching loads? It's the vocabulary that gets in the way of our learning.
Thank you very much, and maybe others who want to pick that up. I think Nicola wants to come in at the back.
Thank you for that. I want to give reference to a Canadian colleague, Eileen Hurtice, who says that really all we need to do is amend the spelling of load. If we spelled it teaching load, L-O-D-E, we'd have a different thought about it. I think the curriculum, to me, and maybe its background in higher ed, has some flexibility. I had a graduate course where, granted, the course was in approaches to professional development. The students came in to a syllabus that had a lot of empty white space on it, quite purposefully. And I said to them, there aren't learning outcomes for this course that I've set in advance. You know what the intent of the course is, you see the description, the calendar, and your exit project from this course is to write your own learning outcomes and indicate how you've met them. Those students went on to present at several international conferences and write papers. So it might be the discipline, but I think there is room for that kind of creative approaches to engage the students.
Thanks again. Anyone? Earl.
Thanks. I fully agree with language.
Would I say who you are, Earl?
Sorry, hi, the name's Earl. I'm not from the TV series. I'm from the University of East London. I fully agree that language does create barriers, but last year when I was at the ISSOTL event, one of the speakers spoke and said, my greatest teachers have been the students I have taught. And maybe the way forward is to look at students as co-learners, not as co-partners in fact, the full sense. And then we may move forward to actually looking at learner outcomes, not learning outcomes.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm going to move it on to the next question, and these questions all interrelate, so we'll keep coming back to themes. But one of the points, in a sense, we've been making is how do we move from the sort of individual initiative to making this more mainstreamed? So the question is, how can we mainstream these approaches so that we move beyond the simple individual innovator dabbling in co-working with students in the ways we've so far discussed? And I'm going to invite Cara to start us off, and this is the point where Cara's going to give us a few minutes reflection on that and broader topics. So you'll notice we haven't done the usual panel one of starting with the panel each saying their piece. We're going to interleave them in different parts of the debate. So, Cara.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me from the back? Yes, wonderful. Okay. So I'm from, talking too loud. I'm from Western Washington University in Washington State. I just graduated in the spring from Human Services and Mathematics. Not quite the conventional pair, but that's what I did. I'm here as the undergraduate representative, just to make that clear. I wanted to kind of talk about three things that were very important in my experience as an undergraduate and definitely helped with institutionalizing and making it so that I was able to participate in a way that was sustainable for me as an individual, but also, I think, sustain the university. So the three things I want to go over are credits, titles, and awards. In terms of credits, we have a course called Communications 339, and it's offered every quarter. It's not restricted to communication majors, and it really highlights the application of skills. Now, the great thing about this course is that any student can sign up for it. And what that means is they get credit for actually learning communication skills, actually practicing them, going into clubs, going into committees, and actually participating as an active part of the education community. And again, as a 339, it is an upper level course. So looking at a transcript, it even applies and is able to demonstrate that the student is, first of all, not just volunteering, it's not just adding it on as an extra thing, the student is actually getting credit, and credit that counts for something. Which again is something that really helped me in terms of not just adding it on my plate, but actually counting towards my graduation, counting towards just the rest of my career as a scholar. In terms of titles, we have a Learning Commons advisory board that I've been a part of, and that's just an example of a committee. I don't think the name is quite so important, but the fact that I was invited onto a committee and that committee has student representative positions built into it. Again, it's titles and positions actually saying, well, I'm not just a member of something, I have a leadership position on this board, in this club, committee, etc., whatever it happens to be. And that, again, offers more than a leadership opportunity, it offers networking. I was on this board with 6 other programs, so 6 department heads and everything, which of course helped in terms of meeting new people on campus, but also understanding what those services were. And again, it's an experience that doesn't just get tacked onto what I'm already doing as a student, working, volunteering, etc. This I can put on my resume. It definitely helped a lot. And awards. In our Teaching Learning Academy, which is, we don't have a Teaching and Learning Center or ISSOTL Center or anything like that. We have a Teaching Learning Academy at Western. And they give out Academy Awards. And the wonderful thing about this, I know a few of us talked about this yesterday in the Curve workshop, is that you give an award in order to recognize someone. And the great thing about it is that it's very specific. It's not just, oh, you're a wonderful person, we like you. It is actually, there's a specific reason. It's an award for creativity, for scholarship. And on each of our awards, there's an explanation of why that individual received it. So that, again, it really counts for something. It's very intentional in terms of recognizing students and enabling them to be change agents. In terms of systems, what I really want to touch on is that it's engaging and integrating students in all of these facets. It's in the classroom, it's in committees, it's in some ways in just the greater education community at an institution. And by offering those multiple opportunities, you engage more than one student, especially with offering credits. What we found is you end up with students who are in that class like, I just need an extra credit, I don't really care what we're doing, I just want the credit. But once you reel them in, you give them the opportunity to engage, and you say, well, you know, this is your opportunity to learn some skills, so actually apply it to do something. And they get really excited about it. And they're saying, wait, you're actually letting me do something with my life. What about that? And so the wonderful thing is, you know, you're bringing in the disenfranchised voices. You're really diversifying the dialogue about what teaching and learning can be and how we can change it. And especially with committees and whatnot, you have student representation that's built in from beginning to end. It's not just an addition, and it's not studying students as subjects. It is including them as partners, as co-inquirers, etc. And so this has just been my experience with institutionalizing students as change agents.
Thank you very much. I'm going to link the next question with that because I think it's very much related, and that's the question of, is students as change agents for a select few students, or can it be mainstreamed, perhaps in the ways that Kara's just identified? How can students be motivated and empowered to participate in these types of activities? So open it up to the floor for any comments. Ashad.
Hi, good morning. It's Arshad Ahmad from Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education Canada. I was struck when you mentioned the word beginning and end. And it seems this is a paradigm that kind of challenges many faculty, that students are only there for a transitory period. Either it's one course, or it's one concentration, or it's one program. It has a starting point and an ending point. And unlike what Chari just mentioned about lifelong learning, there seems to be really a terminal aspect of learning while we journey with them together when we are together experiencing that. But to find other ways of continuing the relationship and their role as change agents, maybe there's two ideas that might be worth pursuing. One of them is really the role of alumni. I think we think of alumni really quite differently as we think of our students, as if they've suddenly become disembodied from that experience and turned into sources of funding or, I don't know, feedback on what industry wants or other conceptions we have of their value in this whole educational process. I've never really heard of alumni participating as learners or contributing to the learning process in a really meaningful way, and I'd love to hear more about that in changing that relationship. And I think the other concrete example, which we really started an experiment last year in our own society, and many of you who were there in June might have noticed at the closing plenary, we had the beginnings of a fellowship of student leaders. So there were national recognition of student leaders who are making a difference in all aspects of change, as described earlier in your slide. And this is an opportunity to create X number of people, in our case 10, every so often, so that they have a place, a community of their own, which they can belong to over time, and that only grows and feeds back into all the important things we do as a society and all of the things we're talking about in terms of learning. I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much. I think it's great that one of the societies is running with us. It's not just an institutional thing, it's gone national. And I think that other societies in other parts of the world might want to have a chat with Ashad about what they've done and can they do it in their country. Do anyone from the panel want to comment back on that? Or?
Can I quickly?
Yeah, please go.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to say, considering I did graduate, I've definitely experienced the complete disconnect of you're no longer a student, therefore you somehow don't understand what students experience at our school anymore, which is very interesting to me considering I spent only 3 years at my university because I graduated early, and even in those 3 years I was involved from my first quarter, and then all of a sudden to be cut off in a sense was very interesting. And I thought, well, my friend used the metaphor of, we're cutting off the umbilical cord and we are no longer communicating with you. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And lucky enough, our Teaching Learning Academy actually welcomes community members. And so I'm still participating in that and volunteering in clubs. But I have noticed this disconnect of, well, alumni, you don't really get many benefits except for paying for things or funding things. And other than that, we just don't really think that you're an expert at all in anything. But I just wanted to comment on that.
Thank you very much. Next question submitted by Leslie Smith from George Mason University. Are you here, Leslie? Is Leslie here? Let's say it went out for on listservs, so not people necessarily coming. And the question is, how do we help students to understand that they can only be change agents in empathetic partnerships with those on whose behalf they wish to engender change? Or she goes on to say, as one of my students put it, how do we help students to, quote, check their ego in at the door when they work for change? Natalie, perhaps start us off on that one.
We have a really interesting organization here in Canada called Engineers Without Borders, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this group. They do incredible work in terms of international development and have been one of the groups that have embraced tensions surrounding questions of power and privilege and inequity in the non-governmental organization sector. One of the things that I really want to celebrate about what they do is every year they publish something called the Failure Report. And they describe their 10 biggest failures they made as an organization that year. And they tease out all the rich learning that came from those failures. And they're accessible online. The concept of making mistakes as part of learning, I think, is a really key piece of having students enter into roles where they are interacting with people who have had very different experiences of formal education, power, and privilege than they may have. Not to say that power and privilege exists in a homogeneous way across a campus by any means, but when students are going into community or interacting with different folks that have different histories than they might, I think this idea of making mistakes and being humble about it and being able to own the mistake as learning with careful guidance and stewardship by a professor so that this isn't a harmful relationship, that something, really harmful doesn't happen. I think this is one of the key steps in getting students to engage in community service learning in ways that are authentic.
I think that's wonderful. We often say, we learn so much by failure, but we're not actually very good at celebrating failure. Perhaps next year we ought to have a session on things we've done badly and where we've learnt from failure. It reminds me in a slightly different context of an American journal here, which is the Journal of Non-Significant Results. I think it's in that there. And it's a student journal, that particular one. Yeah. Anyone want to comment on that? Please, Marianne at the front here.
Hello, Marianne McCarthy, University College Cork, Ireland. One of the things I was interested in making what's coming up in so much of your saying, the student as change agent, and I think when we have the staff as students, we have a very interesting situation. So I suppose what we have been trying to do in UCC and working with staff is to try and see them as the change agents and to try and get them, for example, even in simple things like conducting CATs, classroom assessment techniques in their own classrooms, to see how their students are informing their curriculum and how, if you like, the change grows organically from within the classroom and how that begets then change and interventions they need to take when they realise through the CATs that, things are not as they thought. So that has been a simple but effective way forward. But I think as well, when our staff come to take accredited programs in teaching and learning in higher education, and some of them comment on this, we have written, about this, the changing roles and identities of the staff. So when you put the staff in the role of student, suddenly what your colleague was saying there, who's sitting next to you, when you had the experience of being the student, and then as the graduate you felt, if you like, alienated from that, putting the staff back into the role of student does bring about an opportunity for change. And they begin to see things, and some of them would say things like, there was one thing missing from my teaching, the students, and again, or when they see themselves as students, and again, when we give them, they start playing the role of students. They're wondering again, but is there going to be an exam at the end of this? Am I going to get a grade? All the same questions. We start playing the role of the students. So I think it's an interesting way that when we think of student as change agents, that equally the staff as students bring up, it's like a double take on that, but it puts you right at the centre of it again. So I suppose we're interested in concerning those, the changing roles and identities, and the idea of the staff as, again, producers rather than consumers. So I like the words, can I just say, I'm wondering a little of the word producer, in that, in a sense, it can also come from a consumerist model. You're producing, something, cans of Heineken or something, as well as, in the marketplace. So I like to think of producer, I suppose, as well in the theatrical sense of the creative process of it. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Just on that last point, I think this was the student union at Exeter University said, we're not customers, we're not consumers, we're learners. And I wish many more students would say that. I'm going to move on. Next question is, many institutions only pay lip service to listening to the student voice. So is trying to persuade them that students should be engaged as change agents a step too far? This is going to be really an entry for Alison to make a few comments before we throw it open to you.
Yeah, I've been really interested in the ways we've been talking about language and language use and how we name this work, or what we might do to rename this work. Because language clearly matters, right? And names matter. But one of the things that I've been thinking about since yesterday's plenary in particular is that maybe we don't need to use the same words, that maybe that's a mistake, to think that we can come up with single terms. And I think, Mick, you were getting at this a little bit with the columns. And I would actually argue a little bit with Liz Dunn, who I collaborate with, about the difference between student voice and change agents, as though they're on two ends of a continuum. Because I've always used student voice more as a metaphor, as an idea that represents sound and presence and power, not just speaking to be heard and then other people take action or not. So I think one of the things that we should really ask ourselves is, can we have a range of ways of naming this work that constantly prompt us to rethink what we're doing, rather than settle into some terms obviously, the word itself means boundaries, right, that hold things in. So how can we constantly complicate our terms and rethink them in ways that keep us questioning and being learners? I really like this idea of all of us as learners. That's really the model that I use in the program that I run, which I call students as learners and teachers, for a very specific reason. And this is, I think, something I want to put back to everybody. I call it that because it's less threatening, frankly, than students as change agents. And I think we need to think about the contexts in which we're working and think about developing language for those contexts that people can hear, but that doesn't shut people down. Because it doesn't really end up, I mean, I'm as radical as the next person about these things, but if we use language that shuts people down, then we're never going to be in dialogue about it. Then people won't participate. And so I'm trying always to find language to name things that are in fact pretty radical, that don't feel that radical, so people can participate in constructive and open ways. So that's one thing I would say about naming this work. Think about names that are going to work for you in your context and with your faculty and staff and students, that is going to inspire collaboration and working together. Because actually, I think the work that Liz Dunn is doing at Exeter and the work that I'm doing at Bryn Mawr College is exactly the same work, even though we call it very different things. So that's one thing, just sort of on the level of naming this work at an institutional level or a national level or a conference level. The other thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit was the language that people need to develop to do this work, right? These partnerships are new, right, to all of us. We live in hierarchies, not so much in constructive partnerships. And so one of the things that we work on a lot in our program at Bryn Mawr College is helping faculty develop language to name teaching. Because if you haven't been prepared as a teacher, you really don't necessarily have language to name teaching and learning. Even though you know what you're doing, you don't have language to name it. And the same for students. Unless they're preparing to be teachers, as you've been talking about, students also don't have language to name this work. And so what I've found very generative is supporting faculty and students in developing that language together, talking together and creating forums for conversation where you can learn to name these things. And that's a kind of a community building experience. And I just wanted to bring a couple of voices from faculty and students that I've worked with who have had this experience of developing language together. Just very brief quotes. One faculty member said, "I realized I was developing words to talk to myself about what was happening in my classroom. And then when one class went really badly, I was able to go back to the students and say, I think this class went really badly, do you? And they kind of all nodded, and then we were able to talk about it, partly because I was used to formulating these things. So developing a way to name, what we're doing. And a student consultant, I call the students who work in my program consultants, said a similar thing. I feel like I'm gaining language for how to talk about teaching. I found myself saying things in different ways, or just saying them at all, articulating the strategies faculty can use. I found myself learning how to talk about what I know to a different audience. So I think the themes here are really about multiple perspectives, multiple words, multiple voices in dialogue with one another to be all of us learners and all of us teachers in a way that, that really challenges, I think, the hierarchies that we tend to work in daily. So I would put these questions back to you. What language makes sense for you in your context? And then what ways can you support faculty, staff, and students learning to talk with one another to develop their own language?
Really understand the reality that we want to create. So yes, I think the process begins with integrating multiple perspectives in terms of getting to a common language, though, for dialogue to exist. I think there's still a need for common language, and that involves leadership and vision onto what that reality is, what that reality we are striving for. So I'm a proponent of a common language because to me language describes a particular reality, and if I'm going to take students towards that reality, I need to know the words I need to use.
Thank you. There's several comments there. Whoever gets to the mic first.
That would be me. Hi, Margie McMillan calling from Mount Royal College. We're speaking from there. A couple of things that I want to pick up also on language. One of the things that we did in developing student outcomes on our campus, we had a very wise teacher who said, I don't understand these outcomes because they were in pedagogies. And so we translated them into student speak. And not only were we then more able to communicate those particular outcomes and what we thought students could do with the students, but it turns out it made it much more understandable for the faculty as well. Along that line, one of the things that I've been doing in my classes is being more transparent about why I'm doing what I'm doing to help bring that language into the classroom so that students say, I'm giving you contrast because it's easier to learn by contrast, and then they give some words to talk about that. And I really like your point about labeling students as change agents, because I think some of them may be change agents but would not call themselves or categorize themselves as such. But I think any practice that they would get in empowerment by creating change in our classrooms and in our curricula is what we want them to be doing when they leave the academy, and creating change in their communities. And I would say that in order to foster that on campus, it's the same as outside of campus. What really works well are powerful and local examples. So one of the things, we had students who actually caused a change in the library hours on our campus. They started a petition and they changed it. And when I tell that to students, you can almost see light bulbs go on over their heads that we can do that, we can change things. And I think giving them those local examples of this is what happened on our campus when students took an issue to heart and did something is probably one of the most powerful ways of encouraging that we can have. Thank you.
Thank you. It reminds me, I said earlier on that we got students involved in helping us develop our teaching and learning strategy. Not only did they design it, we then went out to evaluation and we designed a sort of questionnaire and prompts to go out to the students. And thankfully we did think, we better just check with the student union on this. And they read it and they came back and said, the students won't understand a word of what you're saying. And they translated it for us. So that was one of my failures. There were several more people, I think, who wanted to contribute. Carmen, have you got a mic there? Yeah. Carmen? Yeah.
Well, I love this focus on language. And I really appreciate what Alison said. I have to say, though, and I'm channeling a former student, an alumna, Megan Otis, who really got on our case about using the singular student voice. And I understand that this may be a difference in language of the UK, right? But her view, and she convinced me, was that if we use that language, we better make it plural. And one of the reasons is I think this is a misperception, and people like Cara don't help it, because it looks as if the students that we bring to the conferences are the high achievers, the people who finish in 3 years, for God's sakes, and do all these things. And I think Canadians call it keeners. Is that right? People who are, okay. One of the things I've found out, and sometimes I've found it out at conferences, is that the students that we maybe most need to hear from or should be included are the ones who are disenfranchised, the students that we don't tend to look to for undergraduate research projects. They're not the high achievers coming in. They're the ones that could tell us a lot. So, again, with respect to the language differences here, if we use student voice, make it plural. But the other thing, and I've realized I've had a real response to the language of student-centered, and this goes back to the question about, I think it was checking your ego at the door or something. I don't think it's about student-centered. So moving away from the language of student voices or voice or whatever might be really useful to us. And I loved that you used the word dialogue, and that is the word that we try to emphasize in our model. It's about the in-between places. It's about what happens when students and faculty and administrators and alumni talk together in a deliberate way. So I just really appreciate this focus.
Thank you much. A rich discussion here. Is there somebody at the back? Betty? Yes.
Hi, I'm Karen Strickland from Edinburgh Napier University. My question to the panel and the audience really follows on from the previous question. I wholeheartedly embrace the students as producers movement. However, I come from a post-92 institution in the UK, predominantly with a wider access policy. Many of my students are mature students with families or other carer responsibilities. And I think we need to find inclusive ways of engaging students in being students as producers. Otherwise, we're excluding a whole group of students who have no possibility of gaining further skills whilst they're at university.
Thank you very much, Karen. Now, I know there was a group at the International Collaborative Writing Group who are actually trying to tackle, I think, this issue of how to engage the minorities, I think they refer to it. Anybody from that group? I know several are here who would just like to comment on that. I'm trying to put you on the spot. I'm trying to spot somebody. Okay, they might come in later.
I can talk about that just briefly. One of the studies that I've recently, I'm still engaged in it actually with a student collaborator, is focusing on the experiences of students of color in the role of student consultant. And this is something that she is a student of color, and I were looking at because we were struck by the high percentage of students of color who took on the role of student consultant at Bryn Mawr. And we thought, what is that about? That's really interesting. And what we found is that it had a lot to do with the kinds of things that people are talking about having a space within a largely white majority institution where you have a voice, where that voice is taken seriously, where there are multiple voices speaking from people in differently positioned, and how empowering that is to those students to develop a voice within that context, and then how they carry that outside of the context. So this is something that is worth trying to create, again, forums within which students can develop a language to name their own experiences and then share those with other people, and how incredibly empowering and transformative that can be, not only within those spaces, but then beyond, because people take that sense of empowerment with them. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody about those studies that I did.
Okay, I'm going to move us on. I'm going to bring Natalie in now. A question to start Natalie going is, some faculty are involved in engaging students in community development activities and service learning. What can we learn from these experiences for engaging students in the university teaching and learning community?
Thanks, Mick. And just before I start, I want to recognize and express thanks to the Indigenous people whose territory we are gathering on. And so this is the traditional territory of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee people. So thanks to them for hosting us on their territory. So you are on this territory, but, man, can I get a hand? Or let's see, maybe together we can do this.
I had another role here.
But, you got it? You are also here, right? You are here. We are all here. And too often, I believe, that our institutions forget that we are here. This certainly is not the flag flying from the flagpole at my university, But we are all inescapably nested in a series of complex and interdependent relationships that mean we affect the planet. We affect the land, we affect the water, and we affect the communities, human and otherwise, that call this place home. Our institutions are not neutral. More so, this place is changing. Scientists, including Nobel-winning atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, have started to refer to this moment in time as the Anthropocene, literally the era of human, because of the extent to which humans have affected Earth's living systems. So as we are gathered here, the Stratigraphy Commission of the Geological Society of London is currently determining whether or not to name this a formal geological era. We may be in the dawn of a new time. So what does this have to do with ISSOTL? Everything. Higher education is implicated in the state of the world. As David Orr of Oberlin College writes, this is not the work of ignorant people. Rather, it is largely the result of work by people with BAs, BScs, LLBs, MBAs, and PhDs. Glad I got through that list of letters without stumbling. In light of our discussions today, I think that sometimes we overemphasize the division between students as change agents on campuses and students as change agents in communities. Indeed, some would argue that it's this notion of a division that may have gotten us into this situation where glaciers are melting faster than education is changing. When we take apart this division, we see that campuses are communities too, alive with many of the tensions, inequities, and opportunities that exist in community. Really, campuses might be the first places that students experience as relatively autonomous young citizens. And so ISSOTL has a unique role to play in stewarding students into that citizenship. Being able to articulate a disagreement in a teaching and learning policy on campus may lead to someone having the courage to publicly protest a sexist policy from the federal government. Being able to negotiate a change in the assessment structure may lead to someone changing how we value marginalized peoples in our municipalities. And a student being able to generate their own research may lead to a student generating a new way to power our cities. If students can be engaged as agents of change on campuses, if they can be engaged as active citizens within their own classrooms, then they begin to nurture their identity as placemakers, as people who have an ability and the integrity to respond. Perhaps the most unsustainable form of education is that which stagnates in separation from the world for which it is intended. And I believe we all have a responsibility to replace our institutions into their planetary context and to understand that the roles students learn in the classroom as being the changes they will catalyze beyond the campus. In his 2009 commencement address to the University of Portland, ecological economist Paul Hawken said the following: "When asked if I am pessimistic or optimistic about the future, my answer is always the same. If you look at the science about what is happening on Earth and aren't pessimistic, then you don't understand the data. But if you meet the people who are working in this movement and you aren't optimistic, then you haven't got a pulse." You are here amongst people of this movement. Students are here too. Not as leaders of tomorrow, but as collaborators for a planet that needs us today. And changing the way we live on this planet can begin by changing the way we all learn together. Thank you.
A most deserved applause. Thank you very much, Natalie. That really moves the debate on, I think, to a higher level. Any comments or questions about that or other things? I'll take one at the back first, because Earl's had a chance to speak.
Good morning, Kathleen McKinney, Illinois State University. And I've been thinking about that relationship between students as social change agents within the university, our campus community, and the larger global world community over the last few segments, actually, of this panel. And I guess I want to point out something that I think is a little bit ironic, and it's sort of the flip-flop, I think, of what others have pointed out. And that is that it seems to me that at many of our institutions, certainly my own, I'm sure many others represented in this room, we've had major investments in initiatives to help students become social change agents in terms of the various communities outside of our campus community. We have a civic engagement responsibility minor. We're heavily invested in the American Democracy Project and the Political Engagement Project, and so on and so on and so on. But those are all about, and we use the term students as social change agents in all of that work. And yet, I would say, being reflective about my own campus, that we would have people who would be uncomfortable using that phrase for students or think it's too radical, as one of the previous questions, when we think about students as having an impact on our campus community. So I would take the flip-flop. How can we use the institutional structures that we already have to help our students become social change agents in terms of the larger communities? How can we use those structures to also see them and support them as social change agents in terms of our campus communities? So a little bit of a flip-flop.
Okay, thank you very much. The lady in blue here.
Thank you, Deb Courier, Western Washington University. And piggybacking off of what we just said, my mind has been going over and over. On the West Coast, and I know this is a generalization, but on the West Coast of the states, we have less trouble having our students see themselves as agents of change. We have very socially and politically active students. Cara is one of ours. What I'm toying with is, here I am representing, I'm one of 750 faculty, and we're here preaching to the choir of faculty about the word change. And I think that one thing we need to look at as the flip side of it is, how do we get faculty and staff, what some other people call staff, I guess, is faculty, to accept the word change? Because that's the biggest, scariest word with my colleagues, not the students. The students are there saying, we get it. The faculty and staff are the ones afraid of the word change. And so here we are back to language again. I don't have the answer. I like the word agency, because it's a way to slip in change and empowerment without people getting it. But that's just been my thought process on this, that I think we can't ignore the resistance from the institution to that word.
Okay, thank you. We are running out of time, and I do want to give one more opportunity for, should we say, some more voices here, because as it was pointed out, most of the examples in the handout are coming from the UK, Australasia, and North America, but those people outside those areas, and there are several here, how transferable do you think the ideas and the debate we've been having are to your context? Let's go international, away from the usual suspects. Anyone like to comment on that? One there? Anyone else who want to make an observation? One here.
That was rather nice, Natalie, when you reminded us of what our roles are on this planet. But actually, in some ways, what you said is not all that new. If we just look back probably a few hundred years, there's this wonderful passage from Hamlet. Show that he that gave us such large discourse, looking before and after, gave us not that capability and godlike reason to fasten us unused. What is a man, if the chief market and the good of his time be but to sleep and feed, a beast no more?
Well, who can follow Shakespeare then? And I'm not going to try to, so I'm going to wrap this up. First of all, to thank you as an audience, because we did want to do this engaged. It's not the easiest room to do so, and thank you for those who did contribute. That's great, because that's what we wanted to get. Before any claps, though, thanks. My job has been easy. I just got to ask the questions. The hard job was my panel members, to Alison, to Cara, to Natalie, but particularly to Cara and Natalie as two of the students here, and just really walk the talk. So thank you all very much. I hope this is the start of a much longer conversation.